Well, hello, everyone. Just waiting one more minute till we get to 7 o'clock to begin our presentation on our McKinley inventory project, which we are calling the McKinley History Reveal. Of course, this won't cover all of McKinley history and all of the buildings in McKinley, but these are just some of the highlights from the project we've been doing lately. Obviously, there's a lot more to learn about any neighborhood in the city than just one inventory project. So we're really happy everyone's joined us today. I'll go ahead and introduce myself. I'm Jennifer Mortensen. I'm a board member with Historic Tacoma. And with me this evening is my fellow board member from Historic Tacoma, Marshall McClintock, who's going to be doing a lot of the presenting this evening of the inventory materials and results. And then our City Historic Preservation Officer, Ruben McKnight, is also here for a couple of comments about the project and just kind of why we started it and how this information will be used. So I want to acknowledge that partial funding for this project was provided by both Tacoma Creates and the Department of Archaeology and Historic Preservation. Tacoma Creates has been supporting our presentations and our public outreach, and the Department of Archaeology and Historic Preservation provided a grant for the actual kind of research and survey work itself. So I think we'll go ahead and scoot forward a slide, Marshall. So just a quick introduction to Historic Tacoma and who we are. We are a local nonprofit organization that advocates for historic places, and we provide education and outreach to the community. So if you ever have any questions about historic places, a particular building in your neighborhood, or something you see around town, you can contact us. We have a pretty active social media presence. Hopefully many of you are following us. Michael Lafreniere does a great job posting on all our social media accounts. So feel free to follow us and join us there. So this project, this is our final official event of this project. As I said at the beginning, of course, there's always more history to learn. So it doesn't necessarily need to stop here. But this project was a specific look at the McKinley neighborhood. And you can find a lot of project details on our website at historictacoma.org/McKinley. And there's links to other presentations we've done, lots of great information about preservation in general and McKinley specifically. We have a tour with pretty gritty tours that we did, which was really great and really successful. So if you're interested in learning more, please go ahead and visit our website. Go to the next slide, which is Ruben. So just a quick introduction to Historic Tacoma and who we are. We are a local nonprofit organization that advocates for historic places, and we provide education and outreach to the community. So if you ever have any questions about historic places, a particular building in your neighborhood, or something you see around town, you can contact us. We have a pretty active social media presence. Hopefully many of you are following us. Michael Lafreniere does a great job posting on all our social media accounts. So feel free to follow us and join us there. So this project, this is our final official event of this project. As I said at the beginning, of course, there's always more history to learn. So it doesn't necessarily need to stop here. But this project was a specific look at the McKinley neighborhood. And you can find a lot of project details on our website at historictacoma.org/McKinley. And there's links to other presentations we've done, lots of great information about preservation in general and McKinley specifically. We have a tour with pretty gritty tours that we did, which was really great and really successful. So if you're interested in learning more, please go ahead and visit our website. Go to the next slide, which is Ruben.
So I'm Ruben McKnight. I'm the city's preservation officer, and so I just wanted to say a couple of things about historic inventories and historic surveys. The city has several historic inventories in its city database. We also use the State Historic Preservation Office's historic building records. And historic inventory really is the process by which we go out and we survey neighborhoods and look for buildings that or structures that appear to be historically significant by systematically identifying those buildings, but generally by age and location, and then they're evaluated for potential historic significance. This information is important for us because we use it to make decisions about things like land use policy, potential historic districts in the future, looking at project reviews for the way they might impact an area that has historic resources in it. And so that helps us plan and permit things. In this particular case, the McKinley survey is focused on the mixed-use center because the mixed-use centers are around the city are areas in which the city is encouraging and anticipates additional growth. But they also tend to be historic centers where there are historic businesses and really served as sort of the core of neighborhoods. And so we recently did one in the Proctor district, and the McKinley survey is one that we are doing now. And then we'll be doing other areas of the city too, like Lincoln and South Tacoma as well, focusing again on these mixed-use centers, although there are historic buildings all over the city. And so this information, when it is uploaded, will be available to the public. It's actually going to be housed right now in the State Historic Preservation Office database. It's called Wizard. And so if you Google Wizard with an S, you'll find it on there, and it will lead you to the historic records that we have. And so this is just a little, this is just a small survey that we're doing in sort of our broader efforts to identify and protect our historic resources in the city.
Great, thank you. Yes, and I put the name of Wizard in the chat, and I'll go ahead and get a full link if anyone wants to browse that, and we'll of course make the final report available on our website as well. So if you're interested in seeing the work that we've been doing, you can go ahead and access that. So I did want to just emphasize one more time, Ruben mentioned it, this project was focused on the mixed use center, so the green outline here, and Marshall of course will probably also talk about that. As I said at the beginning, there's lots more history to learn about in McKinley, and we kind of had to set a scope for this project. So that's what we'll be focusing on this evening, and that's what the document also will be focused on. So with that, go ahead, Marshall, with the next slide, and we're going to do a little history overview.
Yeah, so a little history overview here. So there are a lot of pictures of the city of Tacoma from McKinley Hill, not too many looking from the city up to McKinley Hill, but this is one from 1891 that I found. And actually McKinley Hill is this in the fog here. So it's beyond the tree line that you see right here, and it's way up here. And McKinley Hill is the highest point in the city. So it has a great view location, as many of you know. And this picture is looking at the upper end of what we call the Foss Waterway today.
So I'm Ruben McKnight. I'm the city's preservation officer, and so I just wanted to say a couple of things about historic inventories and historic surveys. The city has several historic inventories in its city database. We also use the State Historic Preservation Office's historic building records. And historic inventory really is the process by which we go out and we survey neighborhoods and look for buildings that or structures that appear to be historically significant by systematically identifying those buildings, but generally by age and location, and then they're evaluated for potential historic significance. This information is important for us because we use it to make decisions about things like land use policy, potential historic districts in the future, looking at project reviews for the way they might impact an area that has historic resources in it. And so that helps us plan and permit things. In this this particular case, the McKinley survey is focused on the mixed-use center because the mixed-use centers are around the city are areas in which the city is encouraging and anticipates additional growth. But they also tend to be historic centers where there are historic businesses and really served as sort of the core of neighborhoods. And so we recently did one in the Proctor district, and the McKinley survey is one that we are doing now. And then we'll be doing other areas of the city too, like Lincoln and South Tacoma as well, focusing again on these mixed-use centers, although there are historic buildings all over the city. And so this information, when it is uploaded, will be available to the public. It's actually going to be housed right now in the State Historic Preservation Office database. It's called Wizard. And so if you Google Wizard with an S, you'll find it on there. And it will lead you to the historic records that we have. And so this is just a little, this is just a small survey that we're doing in sort of our broader efforts to identify and protect our historic resources in the city.
Great, thank you. Yes, and I put the name of Wizard in the chat, and I'll go ahead and get a full link if anyone wants to browse that, and we'll of course make the final report available on our website as well. So if you're interested in seeing the work that we've been doing, you can go ahead and access that. So I did want to just emphasize one more time, Ruben mentioned it, this project was focused on the mixed use center, so the green outline here, and Marshall of course will probably also talk about that. As I said at the beginning, there's lots more history to learn about in McKinley, and we kind of had to set a scope for this project. So that's what we'll be focusing on this evening, and that's what the document also will be focused on. So with that, go ahead, Marshall, with the next slide, and we're going to do a little history overview.
Yeah, so a little history overview here. So there are a lot of pictures of the city of Tacoma from McKinley Hill, not too many looking from the city up to McKinley Hill, but this is one from 1891 that I found. And actually McKinley Hill is this in the fog here. So it's beyond the tree line that you see right here, and it's way up here. And McKinley Hill is the highest point in the city. So it has a great view location, as many of you know. And this picture is looking at the upper end of what we call the Foss Waterway today, the Dome District.
So this project, this is our final official event of this project. As I said at the beginning, of course, there's always more history to learn. So it doesn't necessarily need to stop here. But this project was a specific look at the McKinley neighborhood. And you can find a lot of project details on our website at historictacoma.org/McKinley. And there's links to other presentations we've done, lots of great information about preservation in general and McKinley specifically. We have a tour with pretty gritty tours that we did, which was really great and really successful. So if you're interested in learning more, please go ahead and visit our website. Go to the next slide, which is Ruben.
So I'm Ruben McKnight. I'm the city's preservation officer, and so I just wanted to say a couple of things about historic inventories and historic surveys. The city has several historic inventories in its city database. We also use the State Historic Preservation Office's historic building records. And historic inventory really is the process by which we go out and we survey neighborhoods and look for buildings that or structures that appear to be historically significant by systematically identifying those buildings, but generally by age and location, and then they're evaluated for potential historic significance. This information is important for us because we use it to make decisions about things like land use policy, potential historic districts in the future, looking at project reviews for the way they might impact an area that has historic resources in it. And so that helps us plan and permit things. In this particular case, the McKinley survey is focused on the mixed use center because because the mixed-use centers are around the city are areas in which the city is encouraging and anticipates additional growth. But they also tend to be historic centers where there are historic businesses and really served as sort of the core of neighborhoods. And so we recently did one in the Proctor district, and the McKinley survey is one that we are doing now. And then we'll be doing other areas of the city too, like Lincoln and South Tacoma as well, focusing again on these mixed-use centers, although there are historic buildings all over the city. And so this information, when it is uploaded, will be available to the public. It's actually going to be housed right now in the State Historic Preservation Office database. It's called Wizard. And so if you Google Wizard with an S, you'll find it on there, and it will lead you to the historic records that we have. And so this is just a little, this is just a small survey that we're doing in sort of our broader efforts to identify and protect our historic resources in the city.
Great, thank you. Yes, and I put the name of Wizard in the chat, and I'll go ahead and get a full link if anyone wants to browse that, and we'll of course make the final report available on our website as well. So if you're interested in seeing the work that we've been doing, you can go ahead and access that. So I did want to just emphasize one more time, Ruben mentioned it, this project was focused on the mixed use center, so the green outline here, and Marshall of course will probably also talk about that. As I said at the beginning, there's lots more history to learn about in McKinley, and we kind of had to set a scope for this project. So that's what we'll be focusing on this evening, and that's what the document also will be focused on. So with that, go ahead, Marshall, with the next slide, and we're going to do a little history overview.
Yeah, so a little history overview here. So there are a lot of pictures of the city of Tacoma from McKinley Hill, not too many looking from the city up to McKinley Hill, but this is one from 1891 that I found. And actually McKinley Hill is this in the fog here. So it's beyond the tree line that you see right here, and it's way up here. And McKinley Hill is the highest point in the city. So it has a great view location, as many of you know. And this picture is looking at the upper end of what we call the Foss Waterway today, the Dome District, we call it today. And you can see down here at the bottom, you can see the rail lines here, and you can also see the industries that are grouped around here in this area. And this was a heavy industry area, and the area around the Foss Waterway by about 1884 had gotten really kind of crowded, and so people were clamoring for more land to develop industries on. And so in 1884, the Northern Pacific Railroad added another sizable chunk of land to the city, bringing it into the city limits. And that was called the first, essentially this area that you see at the bottom of this picture up. And so it encompassed what most of what we think of as McKinley Hill today. And then by 1888, the Northern Pacific Railroad had reached through the Cascades. There was a direct line to Chicago by this time, and a lot more people were coming to the city, and a lot more industries in this Dome District area. And so not a lot of activity up on the hill. There are, we call it today, and you can see down here at the bottom, you can see the rail lines here, and you can also see the industries that are grouped around here in this area. And this was a heavy industry area, and the area around the Foss Waterway by about 1884 had gotten really kind of crowded. And so people were clamoring for more land to develop industries on. And so in 1884, the Northern Pacific Railroad added another sizable chunk of land to the city, bringing it into the city limits. And that was called the first, essentially this area that you see at the bottom of this picture up. And so it encompassed what most of what we think of as McKinley Hill today. And then by 1888, the Northern Pacific Railroad had reached through the Cascades. There was a direct line to Chicago by this time, and a lot more people were coming to the city, and a lot more industries in this Dome District area. And so not a lot of activity up on the hill. There are farms and so forth up there. But by 1894, there are trestle bridges across the gulches where it was easier to get up to McKinley Hill by going via Pacific Avenue, particularly if you've got a horse and wagon, and then going across that way directly up from this area. So the next big event in McKinley Hill history is in 1901, the Northern Pacific Railroad donated about 27 acres for a park. It was initially going to be called the East Park. But in 1901, President McKinley was assassinated. And when that news reached the workmen who were laying out the park at that time, they said, from now on, this is going to be McKinley Park. So that created a really great amenity for the area. And then in 1903, just 2 years later, the streetcar line arrives up on McKinley Hill. And this really does change things. Here we're looking at a picture from 1925, and it's taken from about East Division Lane, and we're looking north up McKinley Avenue. And it looks like we might be around the 4th of July or something. I'm not exactly sure why the banners are up here. But here we see the streetcar line, and by 1925, this area of the street's been paved surface for the train tracks and so forth. And then over here on the side, this building is eventually going to become Parkey's Tavern a couple of decades from now. And then you see here Miles Neff's Grocery. In 1937, he's going to move down the street a block or so and build a nice little new store that will become the top of Tacoma today. Another major event in the development of McKinley Hill was from 1904, when again the Northern Pacific Railroad decided to put their hospital, the Beneficial Association Hospital for their workers, up on McKinley Hill, and it sat at the corner here of East Wright and McKinley Avenue. And so you can see that the railroad, Northern Pacific in particular, had a huge impact on the development. Impact, as I've seen in doing the research on the houses and so forth, on the people who lived in the houses that I inventoried, because you see many of the people with jobs with the railroad in one form or another. and sometimes not with the Northern Pacific, but with some of the other railroads as well. Oh, and by the way, I should mention, these wide porches over here on the sides. At the time that this hospital was built, tuberculosis, or what at the time was known as consumption, was a terrible disease, and they didn't have any treatment for it. And so one kind of treatment that they did practice was having people in fresh air. And so these sort of wide tubercular patients, as well as other patients, to take advantage of the healing air of the Northwest. This is a section of the HOLOC map for Tacoma. And usually when we talk about the HOLOC maps from the 1930s, which was a part of the Roosevelt administration's attempts to address the effects of the Great Depression. And it was to support homeowners who might be losing or in danger of losing their homes. And when we hear about them today, we usually hear about them in terms of redlining. And you can see an area here that is red. This would be an area that was considered to be risky for investment. And frequently these were areas where African Americans lived, but there were also other reasons for them being not particularly good areas of investment. And as, of course, you can see here, this is the Eastern Gulch area, so not a very good place to put houses. And then also the steep areas of the hillside here, as well as the heavier industry that was in this, what we call the Dome District now. But the area that is running from, this is a little commercial district, from about 34th to East Division, and then it runs down here to 64th. But I'd like to read you the description that the HOLOC map had for this area C17. It says, this long, narrow area is sparsely settled. Most of the residents are living on McKinley Avenue, upon which there is a streetcar line. There are large, vacant, unimproved districts on each side of the area, unimproved meaning with no houses. And this is distinctly a low-income working man's district. So there are a couple of interesting things to note. By 1938, Tacoma is getting rid of its streetcars, and replacing them with buses. And of course, it is very much a working class neighborhood, as you can see, as you would see from the various people in their jobs that were living along this area. But it also shows how the concentration, even at 1937, is very narrowly in this area on the hill, and these other areas on either side have far fewer houses and so forth. And that changes significantly with World War II, because with World War II, then the area begins to be a place where housing is rapidly built for workers, for the war-related industries that were here in Tacoma, as well as Fort Lewis and other military bases. So that's when Salishan is built, when it was first built as an integrated living area for workers in the area. And so it's very interesting that our mixed use center really encompasses this early part of the development of McKinley Hill, which makes it really interesting and really sort of, I don't want to say sad necessarily, but I mean, of interest for us because we know that this particular area that is now the mixed use center is the area that had the most development for the early part of McKinley Hill's development. Jennifer, I think you were going to talk here.
Yep. Yeah, great. Thank you, Marshall. So we're going to look at a few stats from the report, and I do want to take a minute to thank not only Marshall, but other Historic Tacoma board members, Kathleen Brooker and Stephen Treffers, who were the ones who did sort of the research on the ground for this report. So just wanted to call out those additional board members who really helped bring this report together and gather this data. So the Mixed Use Center contains a mix of commercial, institutional, and residential buildings built between 1888 and, of course, today. And this inventory looked at 171 properties. So go ahead and go to the first graph, Marshall. So this is a graph showing how, of those 171 properties, their potential historic status. So there are currently 2 landmarks, which constitutes 1%, that are currently listed. There's another, I believe it was 20, that are likely individually eligible, meaning they could on their own be listed on the register. And there's a good almost half who could potentially contribute to a district. So sometimes that means maybe it's not historically or architecturally significant of its own. It's conveys history generally rather than is a specific significant story tied to it, but is still valuable to the broader story of history. And then 27% currently not eligible due to alterations. Eligibility for a register can change with positive changes and negative changes. So if a building undergoes positive changes that make it more closely related to what it was like historically, it can become eligible. So that doesn't mean, just because something's not eligible now doesn't mean it couldn't be with some improvements, if that's of interest. So you can see here in the dates, and we'll make these slides available to folks after the presentation so you can get a closer look if you like. But you can see a good bulk of the buildings were built between 1900 and 1909. But there's a lot of activity happening in most of the decades. So there's a lot going on. Let's move forward one more, Marshall.
Jennifer, I wanted to say something here. So one of the things I wanted to point out was that we see in this chart. There's one is clearly 1900 to 1909. Lots of houses and buildings in this particular area of McKinley are built during this time. And then there's another building boom from 1920 to 29. A second one somewhat smaller. Of course, not very much being built during the Depression years of 1930 to 1939. But it's interesting that when you look at this whole range here, you've got, of the buildings that we're looking at in the mixed use center, almost 75% of them are built between 1888 and 1939. So it again emphasizes the historicity of this particular area for McKinley Hill. But at the same time, I want to also say that we didn't look beyond the boundaries of the mixed use center. And there are certainly other parts of McKinley Hill that are beyond these boundaries that are also historical and that need to be inventoried as well. So I just wanted to add that.
No, that's a great comment, Marshall. And thanks for everyone for sticking with us with some of these technical difficulties. I've switched positions in my house, so hopefully that'll be less on my end. So Marshall just went forward to the next graph, which is architectural styles. And you can see that Craftsman definitely is the dominant residential style. And then you can see the commercial in the gray representing the about 9% of the 171 structures. So the bulk of the structures are indeed residential. Did you want to say anything else about this one, Marshall?
Yeah, I was. This also points out what I think is somewhat unusual about the McKinley Mixed Use Center is it's largely residential. Unlike, for example, the Proctor Mixed Use Center that we inventoried a while back, which is primarily commercial buildings. This Mixed Use Center has a much larger percentage of residential structures than it does commercial. You can see here the early 20th century commercial is only about more modern commercial buildings, but a large part of this mixed use center is residential. Shall we go forward?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about a couple of styles here. So we saw that the Craftsman style was the predominant style of the houses that we looked at. And so this is an example at 3216 East G Street. This house was built in 1923, and we have a later picture about a decade later over here on the right showing it. It happened, they were selling the house or it sold, and for some reason the newspaper thought it was newsworthy enough to have a picture of it, which is great because we have a picture that shows it pretty much what it looked like when it was built. And here it is today. We can see that, and we can see the elements of the Craftsman style pretty clearly here as well. There's a low-pitched roof. There are exposed rafter tails that you can see over here, slightly along the edge where the roof overhangs. There's a fair overhang of the roof on the side. And there are also these decorative braces that are at the corners and so forth. They don't really do anything other, they're just decoration. There's, with Craftsman houses, there's usually a porch. This one's a bit small, but full length porches or half porches are certainly pretty common on the porch. Others, examples will have what are called battered columns. They look kind of pyramidal. They're sloped in as they go up. And the other thing I wanted to point out here are the windows. And so we can see here the little divisions in the windows. And those are called muttons. And this is one of the things about windows that make them so critical to the look of a building, and why we get very concerned about when people change windows and change window sashes. Details on these, a clipped gable up here, which is for some odd reason called. Anyway, this house was built by Gerhard Kirkebo, who was a Norwegian immigrant, carpenter, later became a major mid-century building contractor here in Tacoma. And we'll meet him again. So Craftsman houses can come in larger sizes as well. This is a 1.5 story Craftsman. It's got a cross gable here and so forth. You can see some leaded glass in the picture window here. It also retains its original windows, and it's had its chimney rebuilt. Perhaps it lost it in the 1949 or the 1965 earthquakes. Lots of chimneys were lost at that time. And sadly, they rebuilt it with concrete block rather than brick. It's got a door on it that's maybe trying to be a little more Queen Anne than Craftsman, but otherwise just an example of a larger Craftsman house. This is what's called a National Folk house. National Folk is a vernacular style. And by vernacular, what I mean is that it's one of those that people sort of ordinary folk. So anyway, so this was a popular style from about 1850 to 1930, and it followed the railroads out, and it made mill lumber. The railroads made mill lumber and shingles and windows and so forth available to people to take advantage of to build houses. And this was just a pretty simple house. It's usually only one room wide, and sometimes it's a bit larger, like this one. We'll see a somewhat smaller one a little bit later on. This one is particularly nice because of it still retains the turned columns or posts on the front porch. And if you look at the very back on the left-hand side, you can see what's called a pilaster. That is basically a half of the post that's attached to the wall there, which is a nice finishing touch for the way this porch is set up. Anyway, so very simple house, typically pretty easy to build. People who had fairly reasonable carpentry skills, which included lots of people during around 1900, could build these houses. Okay, so early 20th century commercial. These are obviously commercial buildings. The one on the left here is the McKinley Apartments building, which most people probably have seen before, built in 1921. Early 20th century commercial buildings usually have decorated parapet and cornice, and you can see that really clearly on the McKinley Apartment building with those corbels and the pent roof, and so on. And then below, you've got some apartments here, residential. This is a brick building. And then on the first floor, this would be commercial spaces ordinarily, though these have been changed into apartments now. But we'll talk about this building a little bit more later on. And then over on the right here, we have a one-story early 20th century commercial building. This is from 1925. You probably recognize it. And again, it has a decorative parapet. It's got 3 storefronts here, nice large display windows, centered doors. All of these are very typical characteristics of the 20th century commercial style building. And I wanted to spend a little time to talk about the minimal traditional style, even though this was only about 9% of the buildings that we looked at. It's often called the little house that could. These are small, usually one-story. They usually sit sideways on the lot, and realtors love to call these Cape Cods. I'm not exactly sure where that came about. And notice that the roof eaves, particularly on the house on the left-hand side, you can see this really clearly. There's almost no eave at all. The roof comes right to the edge of the wall. Now we see that the window here has been changed out. That's not the original window. It's not the original size either. But I wanted to show a picture of one of these shingled minimal traditional houses. Because they were small, they oftentimes get changed a lot. And they were small for a reason. These were popular from about 1935 to into the 50s. They were a small house that could be built with an FHA insured loan. And so when the FHA loan program started, it was built around having houses or supporting houses that were fairly small and inexpensive. And so they emphasized simple construction, simple roof lines, simple materials and variations, and no unnecessary gables, dormers, or any kind of decoration. So you'll see a lot of these in Tacoma, and most of them will come from the 40s and 50s. The building on the right here is an example of a brick minimal traditional, and it's got a somewhat more elaborate roof than I would expect on a minimal traditional, but it's still got that very narrow eave, very simple form, and so forth. And so you'll see a lot of these. These were built by the millions during World War II for housing. And then because those plans had already been approved when the first suburbs were started, like Levittown and so on, they utilized the same pattern of small house to populate those early suburbs. And so it's we see it a lot, and a lot of people don't really think about it as a style of house. So I always like to point that out. So American Foursquare is another style or form of house. It can have several different types of decoration. It can have a craftsman style to it, like this one, or it could have a colonial revival style to it. I've even seen sort of Tudor versions of Foursquares. And it's usually either actually a square house or a rectangular one, and it's built on a 4-room pattern. There are usually 4 rooms downstairs, 4 rooms upstairs, and that's where the Foursquare name comes from. This one was built in 1905, and the picture on the right is from a newspaper article about this area in 1907. And you can see that it has a very simple shed roof porch here with square columns, and it's got some decorative braces on those columns. And you can see in the 1907 picture, if you look up at the roof line on the left, you can see the rafter tails sticking out from underneath the hipped roof, which is kind of a unusual example of a Foursquare. Usually they have box eaves rather than this sort of open eave with rafter tails. But it has to do with this craftsman detailing that we see here. And this, I also wanted to include a picture, this particular house, because we see that we've had window sash replacement up on the upper floor, on the second floor there. It looks like the window surrounds have been retained, but as we go around here on the side of the picture of the house from 2021, we can see that we've lost some of the detailing around the windows. When the siding, this has new siding on it, probably vinyl. So we begin to see the effect of those changes that get made over time, negative changes that affect the character, the overall character of a house like this. This house probably, this house wouldn't be eligible as an individual listing, but it would be a contributing structure in a historic district. And the idea there would be that there's enough here that remains of the original house, and with some changes that might happen over time, the negative things could be addressed. And so that's one of the values of historic districts, is that you can be able to save houses like this that are perhaps not individually eligible for listing as landmarks, but still retain and give character to the neighborhood. So I included these because they're cool examples of a house form that we don't see very often. And there are, I think there are actually three or four in this block of McKinley Avenue, which is kind of cool. You know, this is these are both small 1-story, 1.5-story houses. And some people might think that they were craftsmen, but of course they're not, because they don't have those characteristics of the craftsman style. We've got this really prominent gable in the front called a pediment, actually. You know, think of some very classical buildings like the Parthenon or the US Supreme Court building that have these elaborate pediments supported by columns and so forth. And you begin to see where this particular style of small house comes from and what it's alluding to with these dominant entry porches with these pediments here. And so the house on the left here has these Tuscan columns set on piers, and you have even an elliptical window in the pediment there. Over on the right, you've got again some Tuscan columns, and again a very prominent pediment. And so these are sometimes called classical or neoclassical cottages, and they're kind of a transition between for small houses between a more Queen Anne style and the bungalow or craftsman style small house that are very popular at this time. So it's kind of interesting to see these. We see that both of these have had window replacement, sash replacement, and interestingly, the house on the right, the sash has been replaced with a window that has that sort of craftsman style window mutton in it. So not exactly the right style to go with this neoclassical style cottage. also, well, I think that's all we need to say about these, but it was just an interesting example of other small houses and with a different style. Okay, so what's going on here? So this is one of the little gems that we discovered doing our inventory here. So this little house has obviously seen a lot of changes. We can see the window replacement in the on the second floor there, and also on the first floor. It's probably lost the porch deck. There was probably a small one-step porch here rather than what's now just I think just a concrete pad. But this house was built in 1888. It's one of the oldest houses that we came across in our inventory. And it was built by Arthur Lister. Arthur was one of a very important family in Tacoma. His uncle, David Lister, had been in Tacoma since Tacoma had been founded in 1875, or New Tacoma was founded in 1875. And in fact, David Lister served as the second mayor of Tacoma when Hosmer had to go back to Philadelphia with his ailing wife. So his brother, David's brother, Jeremiah Lister, and his 4 sons come from England to the United States about 1884, I believe it is, 1884-85, when they arrive. Jeremiah will open up a foundry pretty much across Puyallup Avenue from where the bus station is today. It's no longer there. None of the buildings remain. But that was the kind of work that he was doing back in England. And it was also the kind of work that his brother David was doing. But David had decided to retire from that. And so perhaps that's the reason Jeremiah came over. But the real important folks are, well, maybe not the real important folks, but are the sons, particularly Alfred and Ernest. So Ernest is a teenager at this stage of the game. Alfred's 2 years older. And they're going to become really important to Tacoma history and Washington State history. As I says here, you know, Alfred was school director, as kind of school superintendent from 1893 to 1899. And then he was the secretary manager and manager for the school board for from 1905 to 1927. And that was that period when Tacoma was building its what we think of today as its historic schools, Stadium High School, Lincoln High School, McKinley Elementary, Rogers. All of these schools are being built at this time, and Alfred's very much a part of that process. And his brother Ernest, Ernest was never particularly interested in getting into the foundry business like his father, and he was much more interested in politics. So let's go ahead and move on to the next slide, Ruben.
Marshall, I'm going to just pop in here to say we only have about 8 minutes left of the hour. So I think it's okay to go a little over, but we may want to just move a little more quickly through the last few slides.
Anyway, so these are 2 pictures. Governor Ernest Lister, he's known especially for 2 things. One, he's the only foreign-born governor that we've had, and he's the only governor who died in office. He died in the 2nd year of his last term. so Lister Elementary Schools are named after both of these guys. And they were living at this house off and on during the time when Arthur was there at the house on East Wright. And so that's one of the reasons why it's a really important house for us. So this is the Edward Young house. This is at 623 East Wright. And it's a slightly different style vernacular house, what we call folk Victorian. Edward Young was early building contractor here in Tacoma, built a number of houses and other buildings. Later on, this was the home for Gerhard Kirkebo that we've also met earlier. And the folk Victorian style is the national folk house that's been really dressed up. And that's what you see here. You can make out the same sort of shape of the front gable and so on that we saw earlier on the national folk, but it's got a lot more decoration on it. And this turn spindles, the jigsaw cut trim along here. And this just makes this house really stand out. And I'm assuming because it's been taken care of, built by Edward Young back about 1894, and then taken care of by Gerhard Kirkebo, and then later by Matthew Klotz, who lived there for a number of years, who was a shipwright. So this is just a really beautiful, beautiful house. There's probably been some window sash replacement in some areas, but otherwise, really just a beautiful house. So this is originally the Saugen garage. It's still a garage today, 3402 McKinley. This is the view from East 34th. And what I wanted to point out here primarily was the mural here on this side of the wall. And you can see in this mural a couple of buildings that are important to folks in McKinley Hill. You can see the McKinley Apartments over here on the left, and then the Saugen garage here, and then a little bit over here on the right in the background there, probably the Porter apartments further down the street. While the garage itself has been changed a lot, and one of the changes actually is the closing up of this side of the building, because you can see in the mural where there's the red car coming out. But the mural itself is potentially a landmark. One of the criteria that we have in the city landmark criteria is the criterion G, which is owing to its unique location or singular physical characteristics, represents an established and familiar visual feature of the neighborhood or city. And so although this mural may not meet our 50-year deadline for historic properties, it is still a important element of the neighborhood, and one that potentially might qualify under that criterion G. This is the McKinley Apartments, originally called the Post Apartments after William Post. So I wanted to talk a little bit more about this because we have a picture of it here from 1922, right as it was had been built. And you can see on the lower floor how those on the lower floor in the old picture, how those commercial areas looked, and how they were open and had way more glass and so forth and so on. And that's one of the problems with this building, why it would be considered a contributing structure in a historic district, but yet would not be considered individually eligible at this time, unless these lower areas on the first floor were changed in such a way that it more resembled that original look, so that it could show its commercial aspect. It doesn't necessarily have to be commercial spaces, but it would need to show that. And I wanted to point this out as just an example of one of those buildings that could, with some changes, become eligible, but right now is not individually eligible, but would be a contributing structure within a mixed-use center. Jennifer, do we want to stop going through and maybe move on toward the end, since I've been babbling on and taking up too much time?
I mean, you only have about 4 slides left, so I think maybe just a real quick breeze through of those would be good.
Okay, sorry, I'm going on too long.
That's okay. I think people are interested.
Okay, so let's move on to the next slide. Okay, so this is Bethlehem Evangelical Lutheran Church, and we have 3 pictures here. The 1906 picture is the year this was built, and this church building is important. It's the oldest church building on McKinley Hill, and it represents an integral part of the culture of early McKinley Hill. There was a large Norwegian community on McKinley Hill early on, and this was one of 2 Lutheran churches in this part of McKinley. The other one has been demolished, and so we see, you know, how this church has changed over time, but I think it still retains a lot of its integrity, and certainly has a really strong connection to the immigrant history of McKinley Hill, and it still does, because today it's Iglesia La Roca Church, which is a primarily Hispanic church, you know, and so still we see the immigrant communities in Tacoma and reutilizing the same sacred spaces that have been in our neighborhoods from the very beginning, which I think is really great. So another church, this little church sits outside, just outside the mixed-use center boundaries, but I wanted to include it because a lot of people ask about it and are curious about it. So it started off as the Methodist Church, and you can see it over here from 1910. A picture that was taken about 1910. Church was built in 1908. It's in the Craftsman style. You can see the rafter tails, you can see the braces, and so on. In the contemporary picture, you can see that there's been an addition made to the front, an entry area. There's also an addition at the rear. The original windows are still here, but it has been re-sided with some kind of, I think, probably vinyl siding. It's always interesting to find out what might be underneath the vinyl siding, because frequently the old siding is still there, needs perhaps repair. But today it's the Tacoma Indian Baptist Church. So again, still functioning as a sacred space, still being utilized by Tacomans. And just to give you a little more background history, so McKinley Park Methodist Church merged with another congregation that was lower down the hill toward the Dome District, and they formed what would become Trinity Methodist. which is over on East 35th today, and known as Calavera Methodist Church. So this is the Park Theater. Park Theater was a really important part of McKinley history. It operated from 1910, about 1910, till 1962 or 3 or so. Never quite sure exactly when it stopped being a theater itself. Over here on the right, you see a picture from about 1925 that shows what the building looked like. And you can see that it had some storefronts on the first floor, and had a stucco facade to it. And about the only thing that remains in the current building is just that very bit of cornice up at the top. And it's covered now with sometimes called gypcrete or marblecrete, a kind of stucco that just has covered up everything. And we would really love to see what's underneath there, because a lot of times when you take this stuff off, there's a lot of the original details are still there. This building today is ineligible because of obviously all of the changes. It wouldn't even be a contributing structure in a historic district today. But again, the possibility of taking the gypcrete off, I've seen that done on a building in Proctor, as well as some downtown. Sometimes you can find details there and so forth, at least window openings and whatnot. So, but someone would have to invest in the money and so forth to try to do that. But the Park Theater was just a really central entertainment venue for McKinley Hill. And as you can see from the picture here, it was not just movies that were shown here, it was a vaudeville house as well. There were plays that were put on, comedy acts, singers, and so forth. Really, really a critical piece, and it would be really great to have it back. So I just wanted to show this one. This is a little corner store, a little neighborhood commercial area that would have been at a stop on the streetcar. It's the Fields grocery store, and was built about, the two-story building was built about 1906, and the one-story building next to it was built in 1910. And then there's another little building further on that was built in 1923. And this is another building that sadly has been changed so much that it's not eligible individually or even as a contributing structure. And you can see over here from the inventory picture in 1977, when the people who were doing the inventory at the time thought that it was significant enough to inventory. And you can see the detailing around the parapet. You can see the windows. You can see how the windows have been changed, and even the window openings changed in the current building, and so forth. But again, once you took off of the new siding that's been put on and so forth, there may be some of these details that remain. Again, a building, when we talk about eligibility for the register, for the historic register, it's not an absolute decision, because you can restore the building and then it could become eligible. So just because a building is deemed uneligible at a particular time doesn't necessarily mean that it's lost everything and might as well be destroyed, because a lot of times these buildings can be brought back. Anyway, that's the last one, I think.
Great. Well, I mean, you obviously, Marshall, worked very hard on all of this research along with our other board members. So I just want to take a few minutes here at the end to discuss the public survey that we sent out in sort of concert with this project we were doing on the history. And one of the questions we asked was, what 3 words describe McKinley to you? And this is a word cloud that I generated from those results. And basically, if you've never seen a word cloud before, it's the bigger the word, the more times it was listed in the group of words. So you can see some of the keywords here that folks from all across the city, we targeted the survey at McKinley, folks who live in or have lived in McKinley, but it was open to just anyone interested. So some other questions that we asked were places that mattered to people. And far and away, McKinley Park was mentioned over and over again. So that shows what a valuable asset the park is to the neighborhood and of course to the city. Many people mentioned schools and libraries, local businesses such as Top of Tacoma, Dusty's, and Lux Coffee were repeatedly mentioned. People talked about their own home or homes of friends or interesting homes that they saw around. And then of course, a lot of people just listed generally historic buildings, and I put it, do we have a biased audience? People already interested in historic buildings? Probably. So, but that was still nice to see that a lot of people mentioned that those are places in McKinley that matter to them. So when we also asked people what buildings specifically they would like to see preserved in McKinley, and these are the ones that overwhelmingly were mentioned more often than others. As I mentioned before, people did mention individual homes, but a lot of the ones that were repeats were these larger institutional style buildings that kind of have a greater community meaning to the history of the neighborhood. And to be clear, not all of these are in the mixed use center that we focused on. Many of them, I think only the apartment building is in there. So there's certainly, as we said at the beginning, many more.
Jennifer?
Yeah. So
actually, all of them except for Galt Middle School are in the mixed use center.
Oh, okay. My bad.
The fire station number 11 and McKinley are already on the city's landmark register. So they are city landmarks now. And I have a nomination for the Mote Library sitting on the floor of my room here that I haven't got around to finishing yet. There are plans to try to preserve the old part, which you show here in the picture of Galt Middle School. So. Great, thank you for that additional information and that correction as well. So that's wonderful to hear that there's plans for additional landmarks, and that two of these are the two that were mentioned earlier when we were looking at the graphs. Go ahead and with the next. This last slide is just a few quotes that I pulled out of the results from the survey that I really liked. One talking about an active, committed community of residents. The one below that talking about how important the local businesses are. The one on the top right talking about how much effort from the community went into restoring McKinley Park. And then the last one talking about just the neighborhood matters because that is where the roots where this person comes from. So those are just a few things that came in from the public survey. So we're really happy
to have all those responses, and thankful for everyone that went ahead and filled out that survey. So thank you all for that. And then the last slide, Ruben, is just the project. The project link. We will be posting this presentation and the final report on this website. So if you wanted to learn more, you can go here, or of course contact Historic Tacoma at any time. We're happy to take questions and inquiries about any historic places in Tacoma, not just McKinley. So we're a little bit over time, but not too bad. I think there was a lot of information to talk about, and certainly we didn't even get to talk about everything. So there will be much more in the final report. Did you have any last comments, Ruben or Marshall?
I don't. Thank you so much, Jennifer, for helping us through this.
Yes, and thank you all of our attendees for sticking with the through the technical difficulties. After Ruben started sharing screen, Marshall's audio was much clearer, so that worked out very, very well. So I think we will go ahead and wrap up. One last thank you to the City of Tacoma for being our partner in this, and of course to the Department of Archaeology and Historic Preservation for providing grant support for this project. And we will see you all with our next presentation, whenever that may be, maybe on a new project. So thanks everyone, and have a good night.